It was a quiet evening in North Africa, but the words would travel much farther than anyone in that room expected. The desert wind pushed dust against the walls of an Allied headquarters building as officers gathered after another long day of planning. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Maps covered the tables. The war was moving fast, and everyone knew difficult months were ahead. Then came a comment that sounded almost harmless at first. A joke, a laugh, a few words spoken by experienced officers who believed they were simply stating the obvious. The Americans, they said, were Britain's inexperienced little brother. The room moved on. The war moved on. But not everyone forgot. Because somewhere in North Africa, General George S. Patton was about to hear that same attitude repeated again and again. Not just from British officers, but from journalists, observers, and even some Americans who secretly feared it might be true. And what Patton did next would not only change how Allied officers viewed American soldiers, it would help change the course of the war itself. To understand why those words mattered so much, you have to go back to one of the darkest moments in the American Army's early war experience. The date was February 1943. The place was Tunisia. American forces had recently entered large-scale combat against experienced German troops. Many American soldiers were brave. Many were determined. But courage alone was not enough. The Germans were led by seasoned commanders. Their officers had years of combat experience. Their units moved efficiently. Their attacks were coordinated. Their defenses were disciplined. When American troops met them at places like Kasserine Pass, the results were painful. Confusion spread through American positions. Communications failed. Units became separated. Some formations retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Valuable ground was lost. The defeat shocked both the American public and America's allies. Among British commanders who had already spent years fighting the Germans, the battle confirmed fears they had quietly held from the beginning. They respected American industrial power. They respected American resources. But many questioned whether American troops and officers were truly ready for modern warfare. It was in this atmosphere that jokes and comments about America's role began to spread. Britain had been fighting since 1939. America had entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. To some veteran officers, the Americans looked like newcomers trying to join a game that others had already been playing for years. The phrase "Britain's inexperienced little brother" reflected that attitude perfectly. And Patton hated it. Not because his pride was hurt, because he feared that parts of it were true. That was the difference between Patton and many other commanders. When he heard criticism, he did not immediately dismiss it. He studied it. He examined it. He asked whether there was a problem hidden behind the insult. The answer was yes. The American Army had weaknesses. Training standards varied. Discipline was inconsistent. Some officers lacked battlefield experience. Many soldiers had never faced combat before North Africa. Patton understood something most people did not. The British officers were not mocking American courage. American courage had never been the issue. The issue was preparation. And preparation could be fixed. On March 6, 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave Patton command of the Second Corps in Tunisia. The situation was serious. American confidence had been shaken. German forces remained dangerous. Allied leaders needed results. Patton arrived with his usual energy, confidence, and determination. But beneath the famous image was a commander who understood exactly how much work needed to be done. He immediately began inspecting units. What he saw angered him. Soldiers appeared in uniforms that did not meet regulations. Vehicles were poorly maintained. Discipline was uneven. Basic military standards were being ignored. Many soldiers saw these issues as small matters. Patton saw them differently. He believed armies that ignored small details eventually failed at large ones. So, he acted. Fast, helmets became mandatory. Uniform standards tightened. Vehicle maintenance improved. Officers faced greater accountability. Training increased. Patton seemed to be everywhere at once. He visited camps unexpectedly. He inspected positions personally. He questioned officers directly. He demanded excellence constantly. Many soldiers found him intimidating. Some disliked him. Others admired him. But everyone understood one thing. The army was changing. What made Patton different was that he never accepted excuses. When people blamed bad weather, he expected solutions. When people blamed difficult terrain, he expected adaptation. When people blamed inexperience, he expected improvement. Day after day, the pressure increased. And slowly, the results began to appear. The same soldiers who had looked uncertain weeks earlier started performing with greater confidence. Units moved more efficiently. Officers became more aggressive. Training became sharper. Standards became higher. Patton was not simply preparing troops for battle. He was rebuilding their identity. Meanwhile, the wider Allied world continued watching. British officers still held doubts. Some remained polite. Others remained skeptical. The memory of Kasserine Pass was still fresh. One successful inspection would not erase it. One motivational speech would not erase it. Only battlefield performance could change minds. Patton understood that better than anyone. That is why he focused so heavily on action rather than arguments. He did not launch public campaigns demanding respect. He did not spend his time responding to critics. He concentrated on preparing for combat. Because he knew something important. Respect earned through results lasts longer than respect demanded through words. As spring approached, American forces became increasingly effective. Operations improved. Coordination improved. Confidence improved. The transformation was not instant. Mistakes still occurred. Problems still appeared. But the overall direction was clear. The army that had stumbled earlier in the campaign was becoming something different. German commanders noticed. Allied commanders noticed. And eventually, British officers noticed too. One reason this transformation mattered so much was the nature of the enemy. The Germans were not easy opponents. Units commanded by experienced leaders continued fighting skillfully throughout Tunisia. Every success had to be earned. Every mile required effort. There were no shortcuts. That reality made American improvements impossible to ignore. Victories against weak opponents might have been dismissed. Victories against experienced German forces could not. As operations continued through 1943, American troops increasingly demonstrated their growing effectiveness. The learning curve was steep. Combat experience accumulated rapidly. Young officers became seasoned leaders. Inexperienced soldiers became veterans. Lessons learned in defeat were applied in future battles. Patton encouraged this process relentlessly. He believed armies improved through constant adaptation. What mattered was not whether mistakes happened. What mattered was whether they were repeated. The psychological impact of this change was enormous. Months earlier, many American soldiers had entered combat carrying the burden of doubt. They knew critics existed. They knew some allies questioned them. They knew newspapers discussed failures. That pressure could destroy an army. Instead, it became motivation. Every successful operation challenged old assumptions. Every victory weakened old stereotypes. Every improvement made the phrase "inexperienced little brother" sound increasingly outdated. Yet Patton's greatest achievement was not tactical. It was cultural. He helped create an expectation of excellence. Before, many units had been focused on avoiding failure. Patton wanted them focused on achieving success. That difference changed everything. An army trying not to lose behaves differently from an army determined to win. Aggression increased. Initiative increased. Confidence increased. And confidence is contagious. When soldiers believe in themselves, they perform differently. When officers trust their units, decisions become faster. When entire formations believe they can succeed, momentum grows. That momentum was becoming visible across the battlefield. Patton's approach was never gentle. He demanded more than many thought possible. He criticized openly. He pushed relentlessly. His methods remain controversial even today. But during those crucial months in North Africa, many of his changes produced real results. The Americans were learning, fast, and the critics were running out of evidence. By May 1943, the Tunisian campaign was reaching its conclusion. Axis forces in North Africa faced growing pressure. Allied cooperation improved. American units contributed significantly to final operations. The campaign that had begun with painful defeats ended with important successes. For many observers, the contrast was striking. The same army criticized after Kasserine Pass now looked far more capable. The same soldiers once described as inexperienced now possessed valuable combat knowledge. The same officers once doubted by allies had gained credibility through performance. This transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because leaders like Patton refused to accept mediocrity. But perhaps the most interesting part of the story is what Patton did not do. He never launched a personal crusade against British officers. He never turned disagreements into public feuds. He never allowed Allied cooperation to collapse because of wounded pride. That would have been easy. Instead, he focused on the larger mission. Defeating Germany mattered more than winning arguments. Patton certainly had a strong personality. He could be blunt, he could be aggressive, he could be difficult. But he understood that Allied victory depended on cooperation. The Americans and British needed each other. Both nations brought strengths to the battlefield. The goal was not proving who was superior. The goal was defeating a common enemy. As the war continued into Sicily, France, and eventually Germany itself, American forces repeatedly demonstrated their growing capability. The reputation established in North Africa continued evolving. American commanders gained experience. American soldiers gained confidence. American units gained respect. By 1944, many of the doubts that existed in early 1943 had largely disappeared. The battlefield had settled the argument. And battlefield verdicts are difficult to challenge. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine a dramatic confrontation, a moment where Patton hears the insult, storms into a room, and delivers a fiery speech that silences everyone. But history is usually more interesting than that. The real story is not about one conversation. It is about one response. When faced with criticism, Patton did not respond with anger. He responded with preparation. When faced with mockery, he responded with training. When faced with doubt, he responded with performance. That approach ultimately proved far more powerful. Because words can be argued with, results cannot. Years later, many people remembered Patton for his speeches, his personality, and his dramatic leadership style. But one of his most important qualities was his refusal to hide from uncomfortable truths. When critics pointed out weaknesses, he looked for ways to eliminate them. When failures occurred, he looked for lessons. When confidence dropped, he worked to rebuild it. Those habits helped transform American forces during a critical stage of the war. and they helped ensure that the label of Britain's inexperienced little brother would not survive for long. The irony is that the officers who made such comments were not entirely wrong at the beginning. America was less experienced. Its army was still learning. Its officers still faced a steep learning curve. But Patton understood something they overlooked. Experience can be gained. Skill can be developed. Confidence can be built. An army is not frozen in time. It evolves. And the American army of late 1943 was not the same army that had struggled earlier that year. That evolution became one of the most important military stories of World War II. From North Africa to Western Europe, American forces continued improving at remarkable speed. Lessons traveled from battlefield to battlefield. Training adapted, leadership improved, combat effectiveness increased. The transformation that began under intense pressure became one of the foundations of Allied success. In the end, Patton's answer to the mockery was surprisingly simple. He never tried to win the argument. He made the argument irrelevant by demanding higher standards, enforcing discipline, improving training, and insisting on results. He helped create an army that no longer needed anyone's approval. Respect arrived on its own, not because people were persuaded, because they were convinced. And that is why this story still matters today. On that dusty evening when officers laughed and spoke of America's inexperienced little brother, they believed they were describing reality. For a moment, perhaps they were. But Patton saw something they did not. He saw what that army could become. Then he spent every day proving it. The desert winds of Tunisia have long since faded. The headquarters buildings are silent. The maps have disappeared. The officers are gone. But the lesson remains as powerful as ever. When George Patton heard the doubts, he did not answer them with words. He answered them with transformation. And that transformation echoed across battlefields all the way to victory in Europe.